recently designed by the government of Morocco under His Majesty King Mohammed VI to increase the agricultural production in Morocco and make of agriculture a twofold target. One, produce high cash crops for exports to bring some money to the country. And second, what we call social agriculture to help the small farmers to increase, to improve their living conditions and their production performance, while keeping the family tissue, while respecting the local environment and the familiar agriculture. And to me, this is an excellent strategy that Morocco could come about. And it's going well, because small farmers in Morocco have been organized in cooperatives and small groupments, and they can produce local products. And those cooperatives and local groups have been now constituted in what we call groupement d'intérêt économique, groupment of economic interest. So those groupments of cooperatives can select, they are of course trained to improve the quality of their products, and those products now have made it to all medium and great markets in Morocco and outside Morocco. Every year Morocco contributes to the Green Week in La Semaine Verte, the Green Week in Germany, by its products. And Morocco brings its farmer there. No, so Moroccan local products from different parts of the country find their way to international markets thanks to this strategy, to the Green Morocco plan. Yeah.
Well, like, as a person who's been tasting your Morocco fruit, vegetables, and because I know that trace elements and minerals are in the taste,
yes,
I think you're doing a very good job.
Yeah. Thank you for this compliment, and
Do you
we're
have
happy.
anything else you want to tell the world today? You're going to a conference today about science to action.
Yes.
To action. What do you hope to see from this conference?
Well, I hope to see, fortunately, there will be delegates from different countries. This is not a conference about Morocco or Moroccan agriculture. This is a conference about the future of our planet. And I'm afraid that the plain citizen or the normal citizen is not aware of this question. And in a sense, I blame the scientists to not have gone forth to talk to civil society and the plain citizens and make them aware of the danger that we'll be facing in the near future. For example, the models that have been run for predicting the crop production in the world and applied to Morocco, they tell us that in 2030, our water deficit will be of minus 14%. So we'll have to grow whatever we can grow with less water. The matter can get worse in 2050. And to me, that's the real question. Economists were worrying about the depletion of petroleum. Some British economists said humanity has depleted half of petroleum reserves in only 50 years. It will take it only 30 years to deplete the other half. If I draw the analogy between petroleum and water, water is being depleted in a shorter time, and that is the big risk for our planet. So I'm inviting all the people of this earth, of our planet, to get united and help each other, especially to relieve those of us that are living in less favorable environments. Because what we will be seeing is migration. Those people who have nothing to eat in their own country, stranded by drought and heat, they will definitely move to cooler climates, cooler regions, Europe. It's inevitable. It's not a question of wars. It's not a question of, it's a question of climate. Climate will cause more migration than any other phenomena.
What do you call it, profitable fishery anymore in the world by 2030 to 2050. We all know that because, you know, we got powerful technology and bigger boats and bigger trawlers and all that, and the population is increasing and we're taking more and more out of the ocean, and the estimate is that we will not be able to feed anymore from our population from wild fish resources. We'll have to resort to aquaculture and mariculture. We haven't, particularly in a country like this, you know, we haven't even got a coastal guard anymore that can patrol fishery, you know, operations and all that. So we have it on paper, but it's not really functional. All the patrol boats.
Parliament poaching in PE is horrendous.
It's daylight robbery. They do it in daylight.
Open, you can see them.
Yeah, everybody can see them, and the police is nowhere to arresting them.
My name is Jenny Cullinan, and I'm part of a team researching bees in the wild. And it's the first of its kind. We're into our third year of researching bees. We're based in, our main base is Cape Point Nature Reserve, and we've so far got 59 nests that we've discovered in 77 square kilometers. This is the unique Cape honeybee. Carpensis, or Apis mellifera carpensis, and it's unique in that it's the only bee in the world that can clone itself. And that's an adaptation to the particular climate that we have in the Western Cape. And this bee lives in the fynbos biome, and it derives from the African bee, Apis mellifera scutellata. And we don't only research honeybees, but we research solitary and subsocial bees as well. We look at the ecology of the bees. And it's a very deep and meaningful research in that we look at every single thing that the bees encounter and what encounters bees. So the lizards that eat bees, the birds that eat bees, the mongoose that try and get in at night to the nest to eat honey, and all the behavioral aspects of what happens out in the wild. Most research has happened, particularly in South Africa, for agricultural reasons, or the scientific research has been very specific and hasn't had a broad sense of the connectivity of everything. And I think that bees worldwide are not doing very well because as a species, a human species, we have failed them. And it's the way we keep them and what we do to them. And it surprises me that nobody has done a very, very in-depth study of bees in the wild to understand what they need to be healthy. And that is what we've discovered, incredible things about bees since we've been researching. So to feed that back into the community that work with bees is ultimately very important, to alter the way we work with bees, because the way we work with bees is just not okay. And so we've slowly starting to work with people who want to be more conservation-minded or holistic. Our aim in South Africa is to protect bees in their natural habitat. South Africa is a unique situation in that 90% of our honeybees are in the wild. And it's very, very important that that remains protected, those areas remain protected. Because when honeybees breed, they reproduce new colonies and they proliferate out of our national parks and our game reserves. So if nothing happens to the bees within the game reserves and the genetic pool is kept strong, then we can have very healthy bees in terms of when we use them from an agricultural point of view. But if we put hives in national parks or in game reserves for whatever reason, that would interfere with the genetic pool, because drones congregate in areas and most of the genetic information is passed on from the drones. And so if you're working with hives on the border of national parks or on the edge of game reserves, you can bring in hybridized bees. And when I mean hybridized bees, I mean bees that have been tampered by the farmer who's decided that they're going to play God and they know what's good for bees in terms of the queen, and they do their own artificial insemination. We're not insects. We do not know what's good for insects. And it's high time we stop meddling with bees. We're fundamentally failing them. So it's very, very important that we go back to understanding what bees need. And our research is self-funded. We don't have an agenda from a funder. I sold my house and funded it, and my partner has sold her business and is funded. So we're self-funded, and everything that we produce now funds it. We've teamed up with the University of Würzburg in Germany with Professor Jürgen Tautz, who's probably one of the best bee biologists in the world. And we do collaborative work with Germany, and we're now looking at extending our research to the whole peninsula and into the little towns and communities on the edge of this national park, which is Table Mountain National Park, which is a World Heritage Site. So we have to work with small farms and hobbyist beekeepers. 90% of the people on the peninsula are hobbyist beekeepers, and they want strong, healthy bees. And what happens when you start moving bees for pollination purposes, then you start affecting what bees do naturally. Bees shouldn't be moved around the countryside. They're exposed to disease this way and they get weakened. The reason why, if you move bees, bees have passed on genetic information about flight paths, where to find forage, and how to get there on certain winds. And when you move them away, they're kind of lost. They have to re-figure out where the floral sources of forage are and find that all over again. So every time you're moving hives, you're losing information, and the bees have to relearn it, and it's stressful for them. There are a number of other stress factors that happen when you move bees. So if we can, we're very fortunate living on a peninsula. If we can use the Muizenberg fire line as a cutoff area, and the peninsula is used as almost a special environment for bees, honeybees, that we don't move bees across that mountain line. And we look at strengthening our gene pool of bees out on the peninsula. So if the Western Cape in the agricultural sector suffers huge losses of bees, and in the farming sector, then we will have an area like the peninsula that will have a genetic pool of very strong, healthy wild bees. And from there, one can tap resources as we'll have like marine protected areas for bees. We'll have common areas where bees will be safeguarded and they'll be breeding outwards when they are happy and they've got enough forage, so we have to grow for bees. And then you can get swarms when the bees are healthy and happy and they've got enough forage and they reproduce another swarm. One of the important factors to know about bees in South Africa is that most of the honey that's produced in South Africa comes from alien plants. Our indigenous plants are very good for the medicinal purposes of keeping bees healthy, for the essential oils that they use in the propolis. We've done a lot of research on that, and we focused very much on looking at what plants and combinations of plants, oils the bees are using to self-medicate in the wild. But honey as a production in South Africa comes from things like eucalyptus and citrus and fruit trees and things like that, and canola. So if one's wanting to produce honey, one has to, as a beekeeper, I would say grow for your bees. I don't see beekeepers in South Africa paying much attention to that. And it's really, really important. If you keep chickens, you feed them. If you keep bees and you farm bees, you should feed them. And growing plants is absolutely crucial for bees. They need food. One shouldn't keep any creature without seeing to its food. So every hive needs about 10 by 10 meters squared of flowering plants annually. They have to flower all the time. That's what a hive, a single hive, needs. So if you've got 100 hives, you've got a lot of planting to do. And it's very, very important to know that when you bring bees into an area, there are already wild bees in that area. And every environment has a tipping point. So if you introduced, for example, a lot of people look at us working in Cape Point, beekeepers, and say, wow, beautiful flowers, and 77 square kilometers, can't we put some hives in there? You say, no, the environment is completely balanced. And if you introduced more hives, for example, 20 hives, that's 1 million pollinators. If you introduce 1 million pollinators into that environment, you will affect all the other pollinators. So the sugar birds, the smaller solitary bees, and some of those are specialist pollinators, so then you will lose species of plants as well. So the oil collecting bees that pollinate the orchids, they'll be lost because they go extinct very quickly when they're pushed off their food. And butterflies, moths, will have a profound impact. And I think this is where people don't realize that our natural world has these beautiful threads. And once you start pulling or meddling with one of those threads, you undo a whole lot of others, which you will only realize in time. Oops, we've lost the blue dizer because we don't have the oil collecting bee anymore. And that takes time to understand the effect that keeping bees in boxes have. That is another issue, is that the hive is the wrong shape. One shouldn't use the Langstroth hive. Beekeeping has been developed for the beekeeper, not for the bee. And it's a process whereby around the world now, there's a move away from the square box with, it's like a filing cabinet. It's not the place that bees are happiest in. Honeybees are cavity dwellers. Apis mellifera is a cavity-dwelling bee, so putting them into a box is not what one should do. One should look at what they do in nature. What shapes are they making? And it's round, spherical sort of shapes. That's what we should mimic, or let them make their own comb shape. So log hives, these are coming back in the traditional skep. All of those with natural materials. The moment you bring synthetic materials into the life of bees, that is also problematic as well. And we're strongly opposed to any synthetic material being used around bees. So the flow hive that comes out of Australia. Australia doesn't have any native honeybees. 2 chaps make the flow hive. The whole thing is plastic. It's the most horrific invention to come into contact with bees. When you want honey, you open a tap and honey pours out because the cells have cracked open. You do not, beekeeping is an art form. you need to understand what's happening inside your hive to be able to harvest, not just turn on a tap whenever you feel like it, because honey is food for bees, and they need it for so many different functions, for flying, for their babies, to cool down their homes when it gets very hot. They fan outside the front of their homes, and they need a lot of honey for that. When it's cold, they need to vibrate and keep the nest warm. And so when we take honey without knowing what we're doing to a colony, you can collapse your colony and make it weaker. So there are many, many things that a beekeeper or somebody who's wanting to keep bees needs to understand when they have bees. That number one, if you're bringing them into an area, you're taking them away from their natural flight paths and their genetic information about that area. And number two, that there are already wild bees and pollinators in that area, and if you're going to bring them in, you need to then provide food for them. And I think that's the biggest message that we would have as conservationists is that if you're going to keep bees, you need to plant for them. And you need to know also how many bees are in your neighborhood, are other people keeping hives, and maybe start a community garden and plant for bees. We have a community garden in Simonstown, and we're planting in the one section of the garden, people come and plant all sorts of things. And in the other section of the garden, it's very specific. We're planting indigenous plants that the bees self-medicate with. So it is used as an educational tool. People come through when they go down to the beach, and they can see what plants are being planted, and they can replicate that in their own gardens. We will, in time, we're photographing all the small bees that live in the garden, and we'll put up their life cycles. And we have a big interest in the garden. We want to stimulate many of these gardens throughout the peninsula as well, because when we have big fires, we lose the solitary bees, and they are in the towns. And if we have corridor gardens back up to the mountain, then we can be back up onto the mountain. So there are a number of projects that we are involved in on the peninsula with small towns to assist with restoring the health of the community of bees on the peninsula.
What sort of plants could they grow that the bees would most like use for food?
Well, that's an interesting point, because each biome is different. So in Simonstown, we have to know what are specific in this part of the peninsula if you're going to use indigenous plants. So the indigenous plants would be the buchus. Protea repens is a very important one for them when they're needing to collect propolis and the resins. So Protea repens, all your pin cushions and ericas. So you've got the Protea repens, the pin cushions, the buchus, and the ericas. But if you're wanting in your own gardens, your herbs, lavender, basil, perennial basil renews its nectar every 2 minutes. So perennial basil, lavender, rosemary, sage, lemongrass, lavender, lemongrass, sage, rosemary. Those in a combination, the bees are doing very, very well with those with American foulbrood. So plant those plants, and they self-medicate with the essential oils coming off.
Okay.
Going back to the issue of what to plant for bees, I think that if one looks at colour, bees, insects are drawn to yellows, blues, whites. Those are the primary sort of insect plants. So, but of course, rules are always broken, and insects will also go for red as well. But if you look at a daisy shape, it's for a general pollinator. It's an open invitation. The florets are in the middle, and it's open. So it's open to all pollinators. Honeybees are general pollinators, so they go to many different kinds of plants. So all your herbs, but you must let them flower. A lot of the time people harvest herbs and don't let them flower. So let your your herb's flower. And then if one goes to a nursery and just looks to see what the bees are on, but I think quite often a lot of hybridized species of plants don't have nectar. And so it's best to collect your own seed and from flowering plants where the bees are on. So it's very important to observe all the time what the bees are drawn to and choose those plants and plant those. So
people feeding their bees honey water, sugar water.
No.
Shocks me. I wouldn't even feed my children that.
Sugar water is not good for bees in the same way it's not good for us. So the primary thing that everybody can do for bees is to grow. Even if you live in a tiny flat, you could have on your windowsill a pot of lavender growing. And you can put on your roof lavender plants. Lavender is a big, globally, bees love lavender and it's very good for them medicinally. So that would be the primary thing. Another thing that we can do is reduce our need of products from bees. So things like propolis, honey, pollen. I would never buy pollen. I think it's the way the pollen is harvested from bees is really highly unethical, and it's a very complicated process. If one takes pollen, it has to be freeze-dried immediately, and that's not often the case. So pollen goes off quite quickly. So a lot of the consumption of pollen that people are having in sort of health products is probably not healthy for you anyway, because in how it was harvested wasn't probably done properly. There are very few people who know how to harvest pollen properly. It's not a good thing. If you want to eat pollen, go and get it yourself from flowers. Put your finger in there and get the pollen yourself. We consume a large amount of honey, and I think as a species, a human species, there are more and more of us on the planet. We need to really address that issue and reduce the amount of people, and that we have to tackle with as a species. But we are putting tremendous pressure on our natural world and tremendous pressure on an insect. It's the only insect that can produce food for humans, and I think that it's their food that we're taking, and you really have to be in tune with bees to know when it's okay to take surplus honey from them. And that is possible to do. That if you are doing that and keeping bees yourself, then you should be in tune with the flowers and what the bees need, and when they have surplus honey, and when it's okay to take it. So a lot of honeys are blended, and they are blended with synthetic honeys, if you can call them that. They're made by humans, and so our honey world is lacking in integrity in how honey is produced, right from how we treat bees unethically to actually the product, which is probably a blend of all sorts of things. It is best to always support a local beekeeper, the closest to you, who is treating bees well, so you can get to know your farmers. And that is the way we have to change in the world. We have to change farming and the way it's done. Instead of big corporations running farms, we need to turn back to smaller operated organic farms and support those people, and support people who work with animals ethically, and that we reduce and eradicate completely cruelty to animals on every level. And bees are incredibly cruelly treated, and that really needs to change. The bees are like the canary in the coal mine. They are telling the story of just how disconnected we are to our natural world, and they're collapsing because of what we're doing to our natural world and how we are as a species. And if we tell their story, it's a story of everything has a beautiful, fine connection in the natural world. Everything has its place. And biodiversity is the rule, not monoculture as a rule. And we have to change our farming to introduce biodiverse corridors into farms where the little wild bees can come back. They're the better pollinators compared to honeybees because they carry dry pollen. And honeybees tend to pack nectar onto the pollen so it's wet, so it doesn't always pollinate the flowers. So it's very, very important once you start looking and understanding our role within all of this, which is what we do with studying the ecology of the bees, is also to understand our role. And we realize we have to educate all the time because there are fundamental things that we have done wrong. And that's how we house bees, what we do to them in the movement and pollination, and the stresses we put the bees under, and harvesting too much of their own food, and that doesn't allow them to live a long, healthy life. And then they're susceptible to diseases. Those diseases then spread, and we see collapses. We have insecticides everywhere. We have genetically modified plants, and that have insecticides spliced into the genes that kill all sorts of pollinators. And what we're doing to our planet is we're just removing a keystone species. And once you remove a keystone species, an entire system collapses. Bees are keystone species, and without them we have collapses of the botanic world. For example, in the Cape here, there are 6 floral kingdoms in the world. We are the smallest in the world, but the most diverse. If we remove the Cape honeybee, who pollinates more than 85% of the fynbos, we will collapse that environment. We will collapse the entire fynbos floral kingdom. And so it's very, very important that for us in South Africa, that we protect our bees in the wild before they get sick, like the rest of the world. So in America, you don't have honeybees indigenous there. Australia, New Zealand, they're not indigenous. South America, they're not indigenous. So you've got bees working for humans on farms in these areas, and they don't know what those bees need in the wild, because they've brought the bees across from Europe mostly, and they've used them for hundreds of years to pollinate crops. And as time goes on, those farms have got bigger and bigger, and we've industrialized bees. We don't see them as a sacred being anymore. We see them as a factory worker. And the moment you see that and you disconnect on a heart level, you are going to collapse a species. And that's what we're seeing. The species are collapsing in environments where we've industrialized them. They are not industrial creatures. They are sacred, and they have a beautiful balance when they're working in nature. They work in harmony with everything around them. In fact, when you see them in harmony, the tiny bees chase the honeybees off the flowers. Everybody says, oh, the honeybees will chase. When there's harmony, the little bees, like small dogs, chase a bigger dog. That's what happens out in the wild. But the moment that is tipped and we've got too many honeybees, they will then dominate, because they get up, honeybees get up earlier in the day than the smaller bees, because the smaller bees are colder and they have to warm up, whereas the honeybees are social and they keep a temperature, so they can fly out first. So it's really important that the work that we do, we can continue to understand what bees need in the wild, so we can start to influence a better farming technique with bees. Unfortunately, we do have to use bees in the farming sector, and I think that that's quite sad. But we need to start influencing farmers to have corridors of wildflowers, permanent apiary sites, no spraying. We need to go back to a much more connected sense of what it is to be a part of the ecology of this planet. We're not separate from it, and we're not greater than or the dominant species. We're the species that's not terribly bright, because we're shooting ourselves in the foot by killing our planet and everything else. And that's what we really are missing. And the bees are calling us back to a reality of, if we go, if the bees go, then the humans go. And I think that that's, we need to heed this message very, very, very strongly. So American foul brood has been around for forever. It's part of bee diseases. There are a number of bee diseases. And it has the name American foul brood because the Americans identified it, but it doesn't originate from America. So it is a bacterium. Socrates speaks of it, and so it's a bacterial disease that is very hardy, and it affects the brood, the babies, in their first 30 hours. And once the bacteria is in the brood, it releases spores. It grows and then releases spores that are pretty much around for 65 years. And so it's highly contagious within colonies as the brood just disintegrates and becomes goo. If you put a stick into the brood and you pull it out, it's this long sticky goo, and that is millions of spores about to be released within the colony. But we're finding quite exciting stuff on the peninsula. The African bee is often referred to, that's Apis mellifera scutellata, that's the summer rainfall bee. Carpensis is a different race of bee. But if we're looking at the African bee and Carpensis, the two races that we have in South Africa, they're very hardy bees, they're very tough bees, because 90% of our bees are in the wild. They are self-medicating from plants. But the interesting thing we've discovered on the peninsula, we've written a paper about it recently, is that our bees are starting to identify that the foul smell from contaminated nests or hives is problematic. Whereas if you see around the world contaminated hives, the bees from healthy hives come and rob out the honey and therefore take the spores and the disease back into their hives. We're noticing here more and more the bees will just abscond, and especially some of the bees I've noticed in small towns in the trees where the disease has got into one or two trees and or tree nests. The bees have left and no other bee goes in there. They're not robbing out the honey that's remaining, and then the wax moth come and clean out the space completely, and some months later a new colony comes in and they're completely fine. And this is really interesting. So we're wondering if the Cape bee is outsmarting this disease, because so far it's the Western Cape that is contaminated with American foul brood, and it's been around in our country since 2001, but only the Swedes identified it in our honey in 2001, but it was only spoken about in our country 2008, 2009. There was an outbreak in the Western Cape. So we're quite excited about observing what our bees are doing. They're identifying that this is a problem, and they don't want to go and take the honey that is in these nests or hives. So what will then happen is adult bees can have contaminated honey in their guts when they go off to find a new place to live. But an adult bee can process the spores, and by the time they will be producing brood or babies, there won't be any of the spores left in their systems. So we might see that our bees actually become immune to American foul brood.
Is that largely because they self-medicate by being wild?
Yes, I think it's...
The immune systems are strong.
The immune system's incredibly strong, especially if you look at our floral kingdom here. You've got in propolis about 300 different essential oils from volatiles, from plants. And when bees in the wild make their nests, they cover the entire walls and floors and have a whole curtain of propolis. So when they arrive, they land on this sticky stuff, and they wipe it on themselves, and on leaving they do the same. So they disinfect themselves on leaving the hive and on arriving.
We were talking about they disinfect themselves before and after that they go into the hive. And my question to you now is, do you think that if we were to not be using these sprays that are weakening the immune system, and feeding our bees correctly, we'd be able to get rid of this disease that's killing our future?
Well, I think that, let me just correct you, that it's when we refer to bees, where we research, it's in the nest. We're not talking about a hive. In the wild, it's referred to as a nest. So we don't see bees in hives producing as much propolis as they do in the wild. And that's a problematic issue right there, because there's a whole part of a colony called the hygiene bees, and they're basically the immune system of a colony. And part of the hygiene bees is the resin collecting bee. It's a specialist job, and those bees have to go and collect resins from plants. Resins are released from plants to repel insects, and here's an insect going to harvest this very thing that's supposed to repel them. So it's a very specialist job, and they scrape it off with their mandibles and put the resin into their little basket and bring it back. They cannot offload the resin themselves. They have to wait in the nest for another bee to assist them. So if you look at hives, they have very smooth surfaces, whereas in the wild, bees are nesting in trees and in crevices of rocks, and those are rough surfaces, and they need the rough surface to put the resins, the propolis, and propolis is made up of waxes and pollen and these resins. It can be sometimes up to 95% resin and then 50% wax. It depends on where they are putting the propolis. We're currently researching this at the moment and are busy looking at the makeup of the propolis that we find in the wild. The front curtain, of course, where they're coming in, has most of the resins, because that's where they need to have those essential oils to disinfect themselves. So if we are looking at box hives, the Langstroth traditional hive, which is often painted or it's dipped because it's supposed to last longer for the beekeeper, that the bees don't put the propolis onto the walls and onto the floor, so they can't disinfect themselves. In time, if we have smooth surface hives like synthetic hives, we will possibly lose the resin collecting bee. It'll be bred out because it'll be not seen as important. Now in the wild, everybody has their jobs, and the correct proportion of these resin collecting bees to the colonies. You see less in hives and in the domestic zone. So there again, we're starting to see that if you're going to be hybridizing bees, in other words, you're going to artificially inseminate the queen yourself, how do you know what is important and what your drone is carrying genetically? If the drone doesn't have any information about hygiene bees, and you think this drone is good because it's a docile colony that you've got the drone from. I think a lot of the time people do artificial insemination, the farmers, they do it themselves on their colonies, because they're looking at honey production. They want to have maximum amount of honey production with a calm swarm of bees. And it's in Africa, it's the complete opposite. It's the assertive colonies that produce the most honey. And bees in Africa are assertive because they're protecting their babies. And everything in Africa wants to get in and eat, from mongoose to mice. They all want to get in and eat the honey and the baby bees. So our bees are tough and strong. So that's an important factor to know, is that bees are protecting their young. And they know that when they sting a mammal, that they're going to lose their life, because if they sting another insect, they don't lose their life. but